Good evening. My name is Paul Prentice. I'm president of the Pikes Peak Economics Club in Colorado Springs, and I want to thank you for tuning in tonight. Tonight we're not having our regularly scheduled meeting, which occurs at the Vanguard School in Colorado Springs, and instead we're streaming a couple of recordings that we have made. The reason we're not having the meeting tonight is because it's the night of the Republican caucuses in our county, and a lot of people will be at those caucuses. If I could put in a plug, hopefully, for Ron Paul. The club was formed about 6 years ago now, and we formed in my living room with just a few of us who started really thinking that there was something seriously going wrong with the economy, and we started analyzing that. And one of my friends, Jeff Wright, pointed me to the Austrian School of Economics, and being an academically trained economist, of course I had never heard of the Austrian School when I was in graduate school. And I started reading a lot of their materials from Hayek and Mises and some of the greats of the Austrian School, and they started making a lot of sense to me. And furthermore, they started putting the current events, I could put them in the context of these larger forces at work with the destruction of the currency and the corruption of the banking system that the Austrian economists foresaw. And so we started this club where we just started talking about economic things, primarily from an Austrian perspective, and the club grew and grew, and eventually we started streaming on the internet. We have a meeting every month in a library of the public charter school, and thanks to Trace Melton of Rocky Mountain Streams, who handles our IT and helped us set up the website and does the audio visual for us, we're able to bring you an event tonight even though we're not there live. I'd like to spend a few minutes interviewing Trace Melton for you all, so that Trace can explain a little bit of the technology behind the club, behind the website, and what he's been doing for us. He's been working with the club for about 3 years now, helping us organize things with our website and doing the audio-visual through his Rocky Mountain Streams company. So Trace, if you can come up and maybe explain to some of the audience how to get on our email list and how to kind of access our materials. I should also let you know that another gentleman, Todd Hollenbeck from Students for Liberty, has been helping us by setting up a Facebook site and a Twitter account. So you can like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter as well. But this is Trace Melton, so thanks for coming, Trace.
Thank you, Paul.
And maybe you could explain to the audience primarily how to get on the email list. I think a lot of people aren't quite sure how to do that.
You can get on the email list by emailing austrian-subscribe@pikespeakeconomicsclub.com, and the system will send you a confirmation email, and if you respond to that, then you'll be on the email list. There's also a link on the home page. If you click that and your browser and email are tied together, it'll pop open your email with everything filled out, and then all you have to do is click send. Again, you'll get the same confirmation message, and you'll have to reply to that in the positive.
Yeah. I think the confirmation reply is really critical. A lot of people I've talked to them, they have gone and clicked on the link and they've sent everything out, but they failed to reply, so they never got on our list. So it's something people really need to make sure to follow up on.
Well, it's a safety feature so that I can't go subscribe somebody I'm not pleased with to 8,000 email lists without their consent. Because anybody can click that and fill out the form and send it. So they have to make sure that the machine's making sure that it's a valid email and that you truly did want to be part of the email list.
Okay, well, that's actually a good point, Trace. Maybe some of the audience is concerned about email privacy, and maybe you could explain some of our firewalls is not the right word, but our safety issues that we have for them.
Well, basically everything is hosted on a single server. It's all run for the Economics Club. There are a couple other sites on it, but it's not one of the big things. It has a pretty secure firewall. The email, the website, everything is hosted on the same machine. It's not farmed out to like Constant Contact or any of the other ones. Those sites tend to track. When they send you an email and you click on something in it, they know who clicked on it, where you went, all that stuff. We do none of that tracking right now. So we're looking maybe at the possibility of something like that in the future, but we're also going to ask the club and where they want to go before we just implement something like that.
Right. We certainly respect your privacy and your right to remain anonymous. Another thing that the viewers might find interesting is how to find the videos from archived events or from past events or ongoing events. I know at one point you were posting to a system called Ustream, and now you've got your own company called Rocky Mountain Streams, and even I, Trace, I'm a little confused as to which link is the right one to go and find some of our events.
Well, on RockyMountainStreams.com, there's a tab at the top called Portfolio, and I do list all my events in there. I even did one for Occupy last week too. My caller from the Constitution spoke there. The Constitution Made Easy. Anyway, all the events are there. They are still on the Ustream because that is where they get recorded too, and they are still archived there. They're being archived under my channel now, the Rocky Mountain Streams channel. I guess we could get together and build an archive page once we get the other 30 things on our list.
Well, I think for now we do have links on the homepage of the Economics Club itself, PikesPeakEconomicsClub.com, links to the Rocky Mountain Stream site, which then would have what we need. And every time we have an event that we record, we then put a link to that on the event in the website itself. When you click on the event link in the website, it'll click you to an archive of that posting event. And you've noticed, perhaps if you've been with us for a few years, you've noticed the continued improved quality of our productions and Trace is behind a lot of that. Which brings up my next point, which is we all have mortgages and rent to pay. And Trace Melton surely would appreciate some donations for his work through the Economics Club. And if you want to do that, there's information on the front page of the Economics Club about how to send a check to PPEC, Pikes Peak Economics Club. And if at the very bottom or on the notation section of the check you put the word streaming, that'll make sure that check is dedicated to Trace Melton with Rocky Mountain Streams. I think it's a very valuable service. If you can attend our meetings, more the better. We'd like to have a good audience at the meetings, but several of you are around the country, and I believe several of you are out of the country. So we would appreciate some support for the technology.
Thank you. And I'd also at this time like to thank Mary, Dr. Mary Z, for AllianceForHealthReform.com. She's working on trying to fix Obamacare and the defaults in that. Well, actually repeal it and come up with a sane policy. But a lot of the equipment that we're using is hers, so we do owe her a thanks for that too. And we started out with a webcam that we taped to a tripod 3 years ago and a little netbook, and we started transmitting like that, and now we have a professional camera, studio lights, mixers, audio mixers, and we I think are doing a much better job of streaming the shows now.
I agree. The production quality is up, and the content hopefully remains as high as ever. The one thing I want to maybe you could help the audience with is working their way through sort of navigating the website, the various buttons and links on the top, where they can go and how they go and click on various things that are on the main screen up on top. Maybe
on the Economics Club?
Yeah, for the PPEC, maybe you could help them with that.
Well, if you look at the homepage, not going to the links at the top because I haven't memorized them right now, the homepage kind of has a brief history. Right below that has the most recent entries that Dr. Prentice has put on the site. So you can look there because they're in reverse chronological order for the most recent stuff. The other most important thing is going to be the calendar on the right side, that it's got the events. Anytime there's an event coming up, you can click on the day and get there. Of course, there's the home button or the logo that always gets you back to the home. There's an events tab and a news tab.
Yeah.
So if the events are the events that Paul's either promoting or hosting himself, and the news tabs are articles that Dr. Prentice thinks is relevant to economics and that people at the club would be interested in, and he posts links to those.
There's also a link for our library. We have almost 300 donated books, videos, CDs of economic content, mostly political economy and mostly from the Austrian perspective. But they're available for members to come and just take out. Of course, you can't do that on the internet, but if you come to a meeting, you can check out one of our books or DVDs or CDs. Trace mentioned the calendar on the right. I actually use that almost more than any of the other features of the website, because when I post those various events, frequently there will be articles associated with those events. So when you go to the event, the links are right there to those articles. And if it's a past event, click on the past event, and Shazam, I've always put up a link to the archived video of that event, so you can catch up with us there. So we sure hope you do appreciate the website, appreciate the technology, and once again, checks are appreciated. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Tonight we're going to show two different discussions. They both come from one event. Back in the fall of 2010, John Michael Chambers and the Save America Foundation had an event in Denver called the Economic Summit. And it was designed around these ideas that there is a serious rot in the economy, and the people need to start preparing for the ultimate collapse of that entire system and seeing about what we can do to help rebuild the future economy out of those ashes. And in that event, there were two talks that were taped, again by Trace Melton of Rocky Mountain Streams. One of them was my talk on the moral basis of capitalism. And then the other one I wanted to show you tonight is by Ann Barnwell. And she talks about state banking. She's been speaking at various venues around the country on the idea of bringing banking out of control, the central control of the federal government through the Federal Reserve System and bringing it back to the state level. And in my opinion, hopefully that's an intermediate step towards ultimately the goal of the Austrian economists is total free market banking entirely, with a free market-based currency behind that. There's about three sort of main what are called schools of economic thought in the modern world, and these are named after either people or places, but they're not that. What they are is ideas. One of them is the most popular right now. I would guess that probably 80%, 85% of all economics professors in America would believe in what's called Keynesian economics. And Keynes believed that markets didn't work. He believed that prices failed to clear markets, that prices were too sticky to allow markets to clear effectively and in time, and required government intervention, because when prices and wages were sticky, you could have sustained periods of unemployment. What he called in the long run, we're all dead. We can't just wait for the long run for these prices to clear the markets. And so he set up a theoretical basis justifying massive government intrusion in the economy, originally just with spending and then with taxing, and finally it's come to be the neo-Keynesian idea of almost centralized control. It's become a very Marxist redistributionist type of economic theory. But Keynes in the original idea was that markets don't really work, they don't really clear, and that left to their own you can have sustained periods of unemployment that are harmful to people, and it required government intervention in the form of primarily government spending and government debt to get us out of that. And that's the Keynesian school. It's very anti-markets and anti-free markets. Now, opposed to that, there's two schools of free market economics, and they themselves have differences. But the two schools of free market economics are the Chicago School, named after the University of Chicago, and whose primary exponent of that was Milton Friedman, who interestingly believed in free markets for everything except free banking. One of the problems that the Austrians, and I'll go to that in a minute, but one of the problems the Austrians see with the Chicago School is the idea that you can't have centralized command and control over this one most important price in the entire economy, and that's the price of capital. This control of the interest rate, and when you understand what interest is, interest coordinates production and consumption through time. Basically, Milton Friedman and the Chicago School miraculously cede centralized power of that price, the price of time itself, to a government authority. Now, it's my belief that Milton Friedman and many of the Chicago followers of him, school followers, were transitioning to the full free markets of the Austrian school. But it's a transition. It's a transition I found myself very difficult to make as a classically trained Keynesian, if you will, in graduate school, all the way through then the supply side in the Chicago school, but to come to what I consider to be real economics of the Austrian school. So the Austrian school says, well, we have to differentiate what's called the real economy, production and consumption, people working and trading and pursuing their own values, and separate that from the idea of the money that greases that economy to make it work. So we have the real economy of production and the monetary economy over here off to the side. And in the real economy, people have to save for the future in order for other people to invest in the future. And the price that clears this market for savings and investment is the interest rate, and that interest rate then coordinates production and consumption through time. And when that interest rate is artificially imposed by the federal government, in particular, when the federal government, they always like to lower the interest rate, what it does is distort all the time decisions in the economy and creates a series of bubbles, a series of booms and busts, booms and busts, booms and busts, and leaves the economy with what von Mises called massive structural malinvestment. In other words, if you've kept interest rates too low for too long, below their natural market clearing rate, and the natural market clearing rate, remember, is the rate that would occur when people really save out of their current income so other people can really invest in future projects, instead of just having this printed currency, pretend that that's real capital. So this real capital, real savings, when the government lowers that interest rate, it tends to make more of the future-oriented projects look better than they actually are. So you engage in more production of housing and things like that have very long time frames. And as a result, after 20, 30, 40, now 50, 60, 70 years of this, what we have is basically too many houses and not enough factories. And you can't just change a house into a factory, and I suppose you can change a factory into a house, but it's a very slow, difficult process. And the Austrians recognized this tremendous distortion and misallocation of resources through the capital markets, driven by the government's interference with that prime price, the most important price of all. It's not the price of toothpaste or the price of oil, or even the price of labor. It's the price of time, the interest rate. And we cannot cede that to a central authority, no matter how we may believe they are benign. And typically they are not benign. Now, with respect to the Keynesian school, it's my belief that John Maynard Keynes himself will be rolling over in his grave based on what's been happening in his name. Keep in mind that all he was saying was that prices and wages are fairly sticky, and we need some government spending to kind of get an economy going when those prices and wages are not allowed to clear, or when they don't clear the markets adequately. But what he also said was that the government should run a deficit during the recessionary cycle of the business phase of the business cycle, but it should collect and run a surplus during the expansion phase, so that over the course of that business cycle, over the total course of the cycle, there should be no net accumulation of government debt. In other words, run the deficit during a recession, pay it off during the boom, and you've got a more stable, as it was called, economic stability program to help the economy in the case of sticky wages and prices not adjusting. Now, he didn't really give full credit to the or if you will, blame to the Hoover Roosevelt regimes of creating sticky wages and prices to begin with through their institutional interference in the markets. But what is being done now in his name with these massive government spendings, with continuous chronic deficits as far as the eye can see, of massive proportions, 40% of every dollar spent by the federal government is now borrowed. That's nothing to do with the original idea of John Maynard Keynes. It was for limited government interference in the market and limited government spending, and only during the recessionary cycle, and to be paid off during the boom cycle. And of course the politicians love to spend the money during the recession, but they're very loath to collect the revenue during the recovery, so they don't pay off the debt. And now we've just got a real problem with the massive debt we have accumulated. I want to read you a quote from John Maynard Keynes, in case you think he was really totally hostile to a capitalist system, and he really wasn't. It's this, I'll read it. It says, quote, "By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens. There is no subtler, surer way of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. This process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner in which not one man in a million is able to diagnose." Now that's an interesting quote from John Maynard Keynes, in whose name all this printing of money and all this spending of money and all this accumulation of debt is occurring. But it was nothing near to what he originally espoused. Well, we have two videos for you tonight, pre-recorded. They were recorded at what was called the Economic Summit that was held in Denver, Colorado last fall. It was hosted by John Michael Chambers and the Save America Foundation. And in that day-long event, consisting of a lot of people that were just really concerned about the direction of the country and the economy, there were two talks that were given, one by myself on the moral basis of capitalism, and the second one by Marilyn Barnwell on state banking. And Marilyn is a nationally known speaker. She's spoken around the country at various venues on the idea of having a state-controlled banking system rather than the Federal Reserve. And in my opinion, that's a really great transition or segue to a full free market, free currency banking system eventually. But better to have this at the state level than at the federal government level. So we'll hear from Marilyn Barnwell later. So I hope you enjoy these two videos tonight. They should be most interesting, and we hope to see you for a live meeting next month in March. In March, we're going to be presenting a paper that we'll talk about at the Austrian Scholars Conference at Auburn, Alabama. It's called "Does Government Crowd Out Private Responsibility?" So it's a philosophic, an economic, and eventually also a biblical perspective on human behavior and moral behavior in the context of government regulations. So I hope you enjoy that one in March. For July, we're not quite sure. We're going to have a meeting again, so we'll probably stream something in July and perhaps also in September. I'm not sure. But just stay tuned by going to our website, pikespeakeconomicsclub.com, and there you can click on a link on the very front page that will take your email address and put you on our email list so you can be informed of all of our events as they come up. And of course, you can always visit the website anytime to see the most recent links to events and news stories and other articles that we have posted there. So I'm surely hoping you make use of our website and enjoy us a lot. Now, the moral basis of capitalism talk that you're about to see is something I developed about 10 years ago with the Independence Institute in Golden, Colorado. We started an entire course called Free People, Free Markets. And out of that course came eventually a 3-part video series. This is part 1 of that series, Free People, Free Markets. Part 1, the moral basis of capitalism. The concern, of course, is that society seems to have gotten so confused that about half of your fellow citizens out there in America believe that they could vote for a controlled economy and somehow maintain a free society. And of course, you cannot have a controlled economy in a free society because the economy is the society. It is us. The economy is us, and that's what people do. So that's very dangerous misinformation out there, and the club is dedicated to changing people's minds about that, if I can put it politely. So the moral basis of capitalism starts out, and the idea is that voluntary trade makes the economy work as long as people are behaving morally. And where does that moral basis come from? It could come from one of two places. Come from the Judeo-Christian biblical background of love thy neighbor as thyself, or do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. In other words, no lying, cheating, and stealing, right? Just engaging in moral, voluntary trade. And if you don't have a biblical perspective, that's perfectly fine. You could have the sort of humanist perspective, or if you will, the Ayn Rand perspective. Really, it comes from our humanity. So I think Judge Napolitano frequently says it doesn't matter if you believe that your rights come from theology or if they come from biology. The fact is you have these rights and you need to exercise them.
Moving forward, next on our speaking stage, we will enjoy hearing from Dr. Paul Prentice. Dr. Prentice has served as the chief macroeconomist for the U.S. Department of Agriculture under Presidents Carter and Reagan. He has also been visiting scholar at the U.S. Department of Treasury under President Clinton. Paul earned both his MA in mathematics and his PhD in agricultural economics from the University of Connecticut. He currently serves, and this is where I've experienced some of his wonderful work, as senior fellow at the Independence Institute, as adjunct scholar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute, founding faculty and professor of economy at Yorktown University, adjunct faculty at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs campus, and board member of Limited Government Forum. He's also a fellow at Centennial Institute and board member of the Urban League of Pikes Peak Region and president of the Pikes Peak Economics Club. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Paul Prentice.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Kirk, for your words there, words of wisdom about the economy, and thanks to John Michael Chambers and JMC Productions for sponsoring this. Thanks to all of you for coming up this morning to listen to all of this. I know it's not easy to listen to bad news after bad news, but as Dr. Elliott finished up, we're going to end up with a little bit of hope here. And certainly thank you to all of you watching around the world on the internet today. What I'm going to speak about is a topic that I've been developing for several years called the moral basis of capitalism. Because if you really want to understand what's happening in the economy, you have to understand what's happening to our society, what's happening to our people, what's happening to our moral basis and principles. There's another lecture I have that would have easily fit into this, but I'm not going to do it today. It's called The Link Between the Degenerating Currency and the Degenerating Culture. Because what we have is ultimately we have a corruption of the banking system, a corruption of the currency that is behind the corruption of your fellow citizens. But in order to even go there, we have to understand where it came from, this whole idea of the moral basis of capitalism. I need a little help here with technology on bringing up my PowerPoint. I'm not sure which one it is, John. And while we're getting that ready, just to give you a little bit of the background, to explain myself, what was I doing working for Jimmy Carter and then working for Reagan, and then working again for Clinton? You may wonder. Well, here's the situation. I was trained at the University of Connecticut, graduate school in economics, and in that school, they trained me to believe that if you took money from productive people and gave it to unproductive people, it would create income and wealth. It's called the Keynesian multiplier. They trained me that if you printed these pieces of paper called currency, it would actually improve the economy. So I believed that. And then I came to work for Jimmy Carter believing that, because my parents were unreconstructed Roosevelt Democrats, and I grew up in that family. That's what I believed. I believed that government was good, business was bad, and by gosh, I was going to go down to Washington and help people. Well, it took me less than 6 months under Jimmy Carter to realize there was something really wrong with how I'd been trained. There's something wrong with the basic paradigm, because everything we've been told was supposed to fix the economy, government spending and printing of money, was making things worse and worse and worse. Now, they made the fatal flaw of training me also as a scientist. So they didn't realize, because as a scientist, when you see data, and the data is orthogonal to the theory that you've learned, and the data is real, you've got to question your theory. So that led me to start investigating what was happening in the political realm with speeches coming out from people like Art Laffer, the supply-side economists. Started listening to President Reagan's campaign speeches, and I started thinking, this is making a lot more sense than what I learned in graduate school. And with that, I began a long and difficult transition from being a Keynesian economist through the Chicago School, more of a market-oriented economic perspective, but still not complete, because the Chicago School, for all of its market-oriented glory, still believes in central command and control of our money and interest, the price of capital. So that eventually led me to the Mises Institute and the Austrian School of Economics. And it's called Austrian, not because it's in Austria. It's just an Austrian school, a school of thought based on hardcore free market principles, including free market money. So I transitioned, and people noticed that I was transitioning in my thinking because I was doing congressional testimony and other things, and I was invited to stay on under President Reagan. And even as much of a pleasure as that was, I realized government service was not for me. So I started a consulting business, and several years later under Bill Clinton, I was invited back to the Treasury Department. If you remember, when was the last time we had a balanced budget? Was it under the Republicans? No, it was actually Bill Clinton, and he had the courage to sign those bills, to sign that. Now, of course, the pressure was from the Gingrich Congress, but the Treasury Department is part of the executive branch, and the executive branch was under President Clinton. It was a Democrat. It was a Democrat that did that. Okay? And you remember, maybe you remember, the 1990s weren't so bad as an economy. Okay? We had problems. There was too much regulation. They tried to raise too many taxes, but mostly the currency was fairly sound. The economy was growing strongly. People were doing well. Under President Bush, a Republican, he started the spending that Obama just ramped up to the nth power. So a lot of this problem has nothing to do with political party, and that's why I wanted that that introduction to reflect my bipartisan background, although I am a hardcore Republican now. I'm wondering if the party hasn't left me. The idea here is that these are founding principles of America, not founding principles of Republicans and Democrats. This is about we the people. This is our heritage. So I'm going to speak to that heritage. The idea that a free market economy is part of our lifeblood of America, part of our grant of liberty from nature's God, is our economy. So I'm going to start with that now. We have this particular phrase I put up at the front of this. It says, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. Okay, amen to that. But did you know that was actually the Great Seal of the United States? It was the first official motto of the United States of America, penned by Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Adams. Well, wouldn't today's Supreme Court call that unconstitutional? So you wonder what has happened to these principles. What's happened to our moral understanding of the nature of reality and who we are as people and as a nation? Okay, so with that, I'll begin. This is part of a three-part course called Free People, Free Markets. I'll thank the Independence Institute and Golden for helping me put that together. There's some basic references here for you. Of course, there's thousands of hours of reading behind it, but one is by Michael Novak. He's a Catholic scholar. It's called On Two Wings, Humble Faith and Common Sense at America's Founding. Faith and Reason. Faith and Reason. Two wings of the eagle make him fly. The second one by Cleon Skousen called The 5,000-Year Leap. I'm going to draw that 5,000 years for you in about 5 minutes. F.A. Hayek, an Austrian scholar, wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom, a must read. A book by an atheist, Ayn Rand, a collection of readings called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Because I don't care if you believe your liberty comes from theology or from biology. Liberty is liberty. So let's stop this fighting among the libertarians about who is where and what and just get to the core concepts. It's liberty. It's up to you as to where you believe it comes from. I believe it comes from our Creator. It's fine with me if you don't believe that. That happens to be your issue. Okay. So here's a spiritual perspective on moral economics. J.W. Richards, 2 years ago, wrote a great book called Money, Greed, and God, Why Capitalism is the Solution and Not the Problem. And a very small book, about 120 pages, but a great read by Charles Gove, Jesus, the Unknown Economist. Because you see, we are created, we are human beings. Would you not think the great spiritual books and the great spiritual leaders, in fact our God himself to many of us, would know about how an economy works? Read the Bible, get that biblical content on economics. It's powerful, powerful statements. Okay, and we heard already that the Bible warns us about debt, being a debt slave. There's lots of wisdom there. Okay, so I'll start off with this. And I don't pretend to be a biblical scholar at all. I want to thank, several mentors I've had over the way. One at the Emmaus Anglican Church down here in Castle Rock, one at Fellowship Bible Church in Colorado Springs for helping me work through some of the theology here. But let me give you this. 2 Thessalonians. We gave you this command. If anyone will not work, let him not eat. For we hear that some of you are living in idleness, mere busybodies, not doing any work. Now we command and exhort in the Lord Jesus Christ to do their work in quietness and earn their own living. Well, that was written a long time ago, 2,000 years ago, but doesn't it apply to some of your neighbors? Okay. All right. But here's what's interesting to me as an economist. Behind this statement is an implicit assumption that the natural state of an economy, the natural state of man, is a strong economy in which you can go out and earn your own living. That the average person has some gift that they can specialize in and produce and then trade that with the fruits of someone else's labor. That's the natural state of an economy. If an economy is not working, it's in an unnatural state because we've broken some basic principles of humanity. Okay. Well, so we call this capitalism. Capitalism. What is it? I get a lot of concern and confusion, particularly among my students about this. I asked one student, a young lady from Oregon, what was capitalism in a graduate class once, and she said, well, capitalism, that's a system whereby the strong exploit the rich. Okay? Well, it didn't take me long to abuse her of that notion, but here it is. Capitalism is the economic dimension of liberty. We have to define our terms if we're going to make good arguments. We have to define this. There's so much confusion about what things mean. So I'm going to spend a fair amount of time defining terms. Well, you say capitalism is the economic dimension of liberty. That doesn't say anything until you know what economics means. Well, economics is the use of scarce resources that have alternative uses to achieve goals. If resources weren't scarce, you wouldn't have to economize. Everybody could have everything they wanted all the time. You wouldn't face choices and trade-offs and opportunity costs. Scarcity drives this choice system. So that's what the study of economics is. Well, what is liberty? Ask a lot of people about liberty, and my students will frequently say, well, sure, that's freedom. But it's not freedom. Freedom is license. I'm not free to come and bonk you over the head, take your wallet. I'm not free to come and steal your property or harm you in any way. I'm at liberty. Liberty is responsibility tempered by, liberty is freedom tempered by responsibility to a moral code. So this moral basis of capitalism, what's going wrong with our economy, is fundamentally a moral problem. A moral problem being reflected in the economy. Well, capitalism must be a philosophy, huh? Well, a philosophy has to have three distinct components, otherwise it's just a set of interesting ideas. So to be a philosophy, and by the way, that means love of truth or love of knowledge, you have to have a set of ethics, a clearly defined statement of what is right and what is wrong. You have to have a statement of metaphysics, something about the nature of reality itself. And you have to have what we call an epistemology, which is simply a fancy word for saying some method for discovering what is true and what is real. When you have all those three together, you've got a concrete philosophy. Well, capitalism is a philosophy. It's not just an economic system. That's a result of a philosophy. Okay, it's an idea system. Ah, darn it. Here's back to Obamacare. We just can't escape it, can we? So that's going to be a hard pill to swallow, my plan. Psst, it's a suppository. So, capitalist ethics. What do I mean by that? Okay, let's take a look at how Adam Smith defined this back in 1776. Do you think that was an accident? He wrote The Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776. I think that year was somewhat coincidental with America's founding. Do you think that book traveled around the world at the speed of ship? Yes, it did. Do you think our founders read that book? Yes, they did. We have evidence that Thomas Jefferson met with Adam Smith. We have evidence that Ben Franklin met with Adam Smith on their various trips to try to prevent the revolution from happening, to try to solve the problems we had with England back in London. So at any rate, here's what he says. Every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, some moral code, is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest, his own way. Well, here's what John Stuart Mill had to say, paraphrasing the same idea. The only freedom deserving the name is that of pursuing our own good and our own way, so long as we don't attempt to deprive others of theirs. You see, I'm at liberty when I set you at liberty. I can't be at liberty if you're not, and you can't be at liberty if I'm not. I am not free to take from you, and you're not free to take from me. Well, this really comes from two threads. I'll draw the threads out later, but let's start with the Greco-Roman legacy. Way too long a quote, so I'll just do the highlights. Cato the Younger, 75 BC. By liberty, I understand the power which every man has over his own actions, and his right to enjoy the fruits of his labor. I'm going to say that again because I'll come back to it over and over again. The right to enjoy the fruits of your labor, as far as by it he hurts not the society. Well, that's the same statement, isn't it? Only he wrote that 1700 years before Adam Smith wrote it. So all these people started reading these things. You look at the founders, you look at the great institutions of Western Europe, back when they were great institutions, because they were grounded in these great ideas. These ideas of Western civilization that took thousands of years to bubble up through society. So one of the threads of our liberty goes back to the Greco-Roman legacy. The other thread is what I call the capitalist golden rule. It's grounded in Judeo-Christian ethics. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. These are not just Christian ideas. That goes back into the Old Testament of the Bible as well. It's found in Leviticus. And in fact, It's called the law of liberty in the book of James. The law of liberty. To treat others as you would like to be treated. That's what liberty is. So we have this Judeo-Christian thread and this Greco-Roman thread coming together. Let's contrast this with the socialist ethics, which is said exactly as Karl Marx said it, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. In other words, if you have a wallet and I need it, I have the moral authority to go and take it from you. What a different morality, a different perspective. Okay? Let me go back one. This golden rule, this is called the ethics of reciprocity. You could look it up. It's found in 21 of the 23 major world philosophies, religions, and belief systems. 21 of 23. You might ask, well, what are the other two? Marxism and Satanism. But that's redundant, isn't it? Okay. It's so deeply ingrained in humanity, you may think it is actually a law of human nature, a natural law, just as a mathematics law or a law of physics is. And it is, in fact. We're hardwired that way. Well, back to Karl Marx, from each according to his ability. Well, here's what Adolf Hitler, another Marxist, had to say. Do not be confused when people tell you that Adolf Hitler was a right-winger. Okay, what do you think, the German National Socialist Party wasn't left-wing? Are you kidding me? Who stole our language? Who stole this language? Let's be clear. Society's needs come before the individual's needs. The left is about the collective. The right is about the individual. That's how we define this. When we clarify those terms, we can see the confusion. All right, what about metaphysics? Well, to a capitalist, and you're looking at one, reality is objective. Objective. It's not subjective. There exists absolute truth. And among these truths is that man's nature is fixed. It's rooted in enlightened self-interest. That's our basic nature. If you doubt this, just read the Old Testament. And you'll read stories of love and hate, bravery, cowardice, greed, charity. Go back and read Thucydides or the ancient Greeks or Romans. You'll find the same stories. Read Shakespeare. You'll read the same stories. Look around yourselves at your families and your neighbors. You're seeing the same stories. It's the human nature. Okay? Somewhere above the animals and below the angels, and if you don't like that, take it up with the manufacturer. That's just what we are. Okay? We have this dual nature here. And it's fixed for all time. You could take today's headlines. You could have read them back in 2000 BC if they had headlines then. You could take headlines from Cicero. Read them today. Same thing. This the historian Tyler that was referenced earlier has referenced that the stages of democracy and the danger to a republic or a democratic republic is the people would vote themselves large S from the government. That goes back to one of the Caesars. I don't know if it's Tiberius or maybe it was Claudius. I don't have the exact reference. But he said, our republic is doomed because the people have learned they can vote themselves bread and circuses. So what is new in the world here? What is new? Another thing about objective reality is the following. I stand up here before you on a podium. This is a podium. Okay, that is a word that means a particular thing. And if I was to sit on it, it doesn't make it a chair. And if I'm to lie on it, it doesn't make it a bed. It is objectively what it is. Aristotle said what something is matters. That definition is critical to understanding reality. Okay? This is a podium, and that's what it is. It doesn't matter what I do with it. If I pick it up and bonk you over the head with it, it doesn't change the fact it's a podium. Okay? Well, it's important to understand words. Socialist metaphysics. What do they think about reality? What reality? Reality is subjective. This podium, hey, it's whatever I say it is. Let's look at Stalin's first census. After he was in power for a while, he wanted to find out how well the people were doing. So he hired a bunch of census takers, sent them out into the countryside, and they came back with the bad news. The people were miserable, starving to death, and there was fewer of them than there were before. So what did Stalin do? He didn't like that data. That data was objective reality. Okay? He had the census takers shot. Then their families rounded up and had them shot. Then he hired some more census takers. They went out and they came back with, you bet your boss, good news out there in Soviet land. Okay, that was reality. Nothing objective about it at all. Hugo Chavez says this. He doesn't like the data that shows the GDP in Venezuela is just stinks. So he says it's a capitalist plot. Sarkozy says this. We don't like the idea that the economic data shows that the French standard of living is 1/3 below America's. After all, we are French. So GDP is a capitalist plot. Let's have some other thing more equal. Let's weigh things, and we'll have equality indicators. Okay, so there's no objective reality about measuring an economy. So how do we feel about things? And most importantly, man's nature is malleable. It's not fixed the way we believe. It can be perfected through the state. That they can create new Soviet man, somehow free of this hardwired enlightened self-interest that we have. Well, they've tried that. And in the trying, they've killed between 120 and 150 million people. I'm not talking about soldiers dead on the battlefield. I'm talking about innocent men, women, and children that just wanted to live their lives in peace. And they still didn't eradicate enlightened self-interest from the human being. But when you hear this phrase, I'm going to fundamentally transform America, this is harking back to this. This is rooted in that idea that you can create a new Soviet man. They just don't use those words. Okay. Let's skip the census. I'm trying to make up some time here. What about this thing called the epistemology? Okay. How do we know? How do we know all this? Well, let's talk about the rational mind. Let's use logic and data and science. That's what gave us this wonderful standard of living here, this harnessing of electric power all around us to cool us in the summer and heat us in the winter, run our machines and give us food unknown to the world before, food in so much abundance that the poorest among us are dying from obesity-related diseases. Okay. But that wasn't because somebody thought that Jove was up in a cloud somewhere throwing lightning bolts down on the earth. Because somebody did some scientific experiments, collected data. Now, that might have been divinely inspired to go and search for that. I do not deny that. Okay? But it wasn't the divine inspiration that gave us the science that showed how we could harness electrons. Okay? So we're very much scientific. Socialist epistemology. Well, this reality is perceived not through logic, but through emotion. It's determined by feelings. Ask any leftist what they think about something, and they'll always come back and say, well, I feel that. It's unbelievable. I have graduate students, MBA students, business people, graduate students. And I ask them, what do you think about the unemployment rate? And they go, well, Dr. Prentice, I feel that it's too high. I just want to come back in the audience and smack them on the head and say, you dope. I did not ask you what you felt about the unemployment rate. I asked you what you thought about it. My God, man, don't you know the difference? And they don't. They don't know the difference. Okay, so we have to go back to this idea of reason and faith. Okay. America's founders intended a free market economy. There is no doubt about this. Do not let anybody deceive you. Here's a simple statement by Thomas Jefferson. I think all the world would gain by setting commerce at perfect liberty. Jefferson didn't say, I think all the world will gain by having a U.S. Department of Commerce. Okay. James Madison, I own myself the friend to a very free system of commerce and hold as a truth that commercial shackles are generally unjust, oppressive, and impolitic. See, they had read The Wealth of Nations. They had met with Adam Smith. They had discussed this discovery of economics, of power, of freedom, of markets. Here's what Jefferson's Declaration said in one of its early drafts. It harks back to John Locke's writings from 100 years before him. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and property. Well, he just wanted to go Locke one better and say pursuit of happiness. But you equate pursuit of happiness with property, of course. I'll prove that in a minute. Okay. What is property? Well, you know at least what it is. It's your stuff. It's your houses, your cars, your land, your jewelry. Okay, but so much more. It's your financial documents representing pieces of paper representing those kind of things. But it's so much more than that. It's the fruit of your labor. When you work, what you produce becomes your property. And if you trade your labor and time for some dollar value of something, that becomes your property. You own that. God gave you the right to keep the income you earn. But it's also your intellectual property. We're human beings. We're not animals working around. We're not some plow horse in a field. We're thinking people. We have ideas and hopes and dreams. You take the poorest immigrant, maybe an illegal immigrant. I'm not here to argue illegal or legal immigration, but take one just coming across the border, risked his life, has nothing but a pair of jeans and a T-shirt and a backpack maybe. But he's the richest man in the world because he owns everything. He owns his humanity. He's come to a place where he owns himself. Because property is our very humanity itself. I'm thinking of a bumper sticker. Property is us. Property is what we are. We are property creators, producers, and traders. That's what humanity is. John Locke said every man has a property in his own person. And that was the beginning of the end of this heinous thing in America called slavery. When people really understood. And it took several hundred years for all this to work its way through. Okay, from the founding all the way, from the pre-founding all the way through. But eventually people got it. We have property rights in the Colorado State Constitution. All persons have certain natural, essential, and inalienable rights, among which may be reckoned the rights of enjoying and defending their lives and liberties, that of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property. Colorado State Constitution, Article 2, Section 3. Well, if our income is our property, and we have a right to it, doesn't the Colorado State income tax, isn't that itself unconstitutional? Just as much as the U.S. constitutional income tax is unconstitutional. Okay, so we've got a confusion of words and meaning. Vast confusion. Just to keep on with the thread of philosophy, this is Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. This is the economist version of this. I produce, therefore I am. Abraham Lincoln made a property rights argument against slavery, that you couldn't hold another human being as property because that human being had their own right to themselves and their own property. In her natural right to eat the bread she earns with her own hands, without taking leave of anyone else, she's my equal and the equal of all others. John Adams said this, property is surely a right of mankind as real as liberty. Property must be secured or liberty cannot exist. You can't have freedom of religion if the state can just come and take your church. You can't have freedom of the press if they can come and take your newspaper. You can't have freedom of any time if you don't have property rights. Property rights precondition and secure all the other rights. Now contrast this to Karl Marx, who's just said it straight out. The theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. So here we have night and day. In my view, here we have good and evil. But here we have uncompromising principles. How do you get along in a society where 50% of us believe that we have our creator endowed right to our property and the other 50% believe they have the right to our property? This can't sustain. This cannot sustain. Well, let's go back to the two wings of liberty, this idea of faith and reason. About 3,000 years ago, the threads of two distinct civilizations met, they clashed and began to intertwine. And it wasn't always a pretty picture. But here's what happened. On the one side, we had the classical Greco-Roman, from which we get the beginnings of law, logic, and science. On the other thread, we have this biblical Judeo-Christian idea of faith, ethics, and morality. And I'm going to argue that one without the other is insufficient. Faith without reason is just as insufficient as reason without faith. We need both. Liberty and property were first mentioned in a document a long time ago. In the same sentence in Leviticus 25:10, proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you when each of you shall return to his property. Liberty and property in the same sentence, almost 3,000 years ago in a written document. This was already in there, wasn't it? Okay. How about this phrase from Leviticus? That's what's inscribed on America's Liberty Bell. But wouldn't today's Supreme Court call that unconstitutional? Wouldn't today's Supreme Court call the Constitution unconstitutional? So we have a problem because the words have lost their meaning. The words have lost their meaning. People don't know what's going on. The veil of ignorance has been drawn down over the world, and people are confused and they are lost and they are hurting. And it's no surprise that that shows up in a lousy economy. How could it not? How could it not? We've lost our way. Well, what this is about is the idea that a created individual has free will. That's a distinctly Judeo-Christian concept. You don't get that in most of the other religions and philosophies of the world. Free will. This concept of individual liberty begins with free will and the idea of the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were first to choose. Did it say ever? Misprint. Adam and Eve were free to choose. Free to choose even against their own creator. That's a lot of freedom. Okay? It's a big story here. Pythagoras said this on the Greek side. No man is free who cannot command himself, so there was some sense of it. Epictetus said this, a Roman slave and Greek Stoic, 100 AD. Freedom is the right to live as we wish. God has entrusted me with myself. But here's what's interesting. Okay? The Greeks and the Romans had no God. They had gods. So he's already being influenced by the Judeo-Christian thread that was coming through this Greco-Roman history and tradition. In fact, this road to Western civilization, this 5,000-year leap that Skousen wrote about, is really about the intersection of law and logic with biblical morality, leading to a great deeper understanding of the sanctity of the created individual. From Aristotle, 350 BC, we get the beginnings of logic and science. From Cicero, 50 BC, we get the original ideas of natural law. We don't study Cicero enough in our schools and universities. But Cicero did some interesting things. He wasn't an emperor, he was a statesman. But he went around the known world, the conquered Roman world, and even outside of it to some degree, and visited many cultures and lands and peoples. And he found that no matter where he went, he could see societies were organized along two different types of law. One type of law he called administrative law. Every society had rules about what side of the street you could park your horse on. You know, who ran the courts? How did those kind of administrative things happen? And every society, no matter how barbaric, including his own Roman society, had another set of laws that proscribed against the wanton taking of property and life. There were rules involved in it. You had to have at least an altar and a full moon. You had to have something. Okay? There was no society he visited that didn't have some proscription against wanton taking of property and life. Well, he thought maybe that was like a mathematical rule. Maybe it's a rule of human nature. Maybe it's a natural law. From that, we get natural law, natural rights theory coming down through the Americas. Let's keep going. Okay, we have the Judeo background with the Ten Commandments, laws against coveting and stealing and killing. We had Jesus come to us. And for those of you that know what he did, he didn't do it for you because of your grandfather's color of his skin. He didn't do it for you because of your ancestors' language. He did it for you because of you. The created individual, you. Well, that was so different from the way the tribal societies of the time saw the world. We could fast forward to St. Augustine, who dug into the idea of the individual having free will. We fast forward to Justinian, the just law, the Codex Justinus. Okay, we have these threads, interweaving and interweaving. We have the Magna Carta, 1215 AD, the rights of Englishmen. First time spelled out. The king can't come into your little shack. Your little shack on the plains. If you owned it, it was your castle. The King of England couldn't come through that door without your permission. What a profound difference that made in the way people started to understand who they were and their relationship between the governed and the governing. Thomas Aquinas, 1250 AD, spoke for the first time of the biblical morality of profit. Because you see, when you go to Starbucks and you trade your $3 for the cup of coffee, you say thank you and they say thank you. How can that be a win-win? Because you valued the coffee more than the $3 and they valued the $3 more than the coffee. That's how trade works. Well, he discovered this idea and started to set free a whole set of things. We have the Lutheran Reformation, 1500 AD, with a more direct relationship with your Creator. John Locke's Life, Liberty, and Property, 100 years before America's Revolution. and then culminating in Jefferson's Declaration. Okay? That's how we got there. Jefferson didn't just wake up someday and say, Shazam, I've got it, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You go to Monticello. Go to Washington's home. Go to any of these places. You will see hundreds of books written in original Greek and Roman and Latin. John Adams, self-taught in Greek and Latin. Okay? Because they studied all of these. They knew these big ideas. All right. So the idea is that God was the source of our natural rights. Free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature, not as a gift of the chief magistrate. You have rights antecedent to all earthly governments, right derived from the great legislator of the universe. I'll skip down to the bottom one. The rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. John F. Kennedy, my father's Democrat Party. Try saying that today at a Democrat convention and see what happens. So Adam Smith discovered this in The Wealth of Nations: specialization, production, and trade. That's what creates an economy. That's what allows us to engage in this thank you, whereby value is increased and increased and increased. And this whole idea that capitalism is based on this voluntary, non-coerced trade. Again, Adam Smith is the first person to point that out. Okay? Not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Enlightened self-interest, not selfish self-interest. Libertarians listening on the internet, get this straight. Enlightened self-interest. Moral self-interest, not selfish self-interest. Okay. And then he talked about the invisible hand, where people pursuing their self-interest, subject to the moral code, would improve the economy. So somebody, I think earlier, one of the speakers said something about, what are we going to do about this? Public policy. Well, here's the public policy. What are we going to do about jobs? Take your hand out of my pocket and leave me alone. What are we going to do about the energy situation? Take your hand out of my pocket and leave me alone. What are we going to do about the poor? Take your hand out of my pocket and leave me alone. Because you see, if you do that and you leave us free to specialize, produce, and trade, we create the jobs. We create the wealth. We are the economy. John Adams. Oh, thanks. John Adams said this: if thou shalt not covet and thou shalt not steal were not commandments of heaven, they must be made inviolable precepts in every society. Thou shalt not covet and thou shalt not steal. Take a look at the federal budget. 70%, minimum 70% of that is coveting and stealing. Taking from one and giving to another without their permission because someone else wants it and because you have it. That's just wrong. 50, 60% of your state budget, coveting and stealing. 30, 40% of your local budget, coveting and stealing. We've lost our way morally. That's why the economy's in bad shape. President Reagan, man is not free unless government is limited. As government expands, liberty contracts. That's the true zero-sum game. Government versus the individual. That's the zero-sum game, not the economy. Economic liberty and political liberty cannot be separated. Hayek said this: to be controlled in our economic pursuits means to be controlled in everything. And we had an earlier quote, the quote from Reagan: to control the economy, you must control the people. Because we are the economy. So where are we going here? Norman Thomas said this. If you don't know Norman Thomas, some of us with gray hair knew him, or do of him, 6-time U.S. presidential candidate, Socialist Party of America. The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name of liberalism, they will adopt every fragment of the socialist program until one day America will be a socialist nation without knowing how it happened. So we're waking up. Thank you for waking up. Okay, Nikita Khrushchev said this: we cannot expect the Americans to jump from capitalism to communism, but we can assist their elected leaders in giving Americans small doses of socialism until one day they suddenly awake to find they have communism. This is part of a plan. It's not an accident. Well, I promised I'd mention Ayn Rand, because even atheists can be prophets. Go figure that one out. The ways of the Lord are strange. Okay? This is today's headlines written in 1957 in a book called Atlas Shrugged. 50 years ago, when you see that trading is done not by consent but by compulsion, when you see that in order to produce you need to obtain permission from men who produce nothing, when you see that money is flowing to those who deal not in goods but in favors, when you see that men get richer by graft and by pull, think General Electric, than by work, and your laws don't protect you against them but protect them against you, when you see corruption being rewarded and honesty becoming a self-sacrifice, you may know your society is doomed. Now, not every prophecy has to be fulfilled. We have choice. Okay, so let's move forward and avoid this prophecy. All right. There's nothing new under the sun. Right? You know, nothing new. None of this is new. There's not a single new idea coming out of my mouth. Cicero said this: the arrogance of officialdom should be tempered and controlled, and assistance to foreign lands should be curtailed, lest Rome fail. What substitute the word America? What do you get? 2,000 years later, same thing. Plutarch said this: the real destroyer of the liberties of the people is he who spreads among them bounties, donations, and benefits. And we have destroyers in charge of our government in Washington, D.C., in charge of our government in Denver, in charge of your local governments. We have destroyers of liberty in charge of those governments. So can we go back to the future? Well, meaning, can the future contain the seeds of our past? I'm hoping. If ye love wealth greater than liberty, the tranquility of servitude greater than the animating contest for freedom, crouch down and lick the hands that feed you, and may posterity forget that ye were our countrymen. You see, Sam Adams thought he was giving a speech to a rabble crowd in Boston. He was speaking to you. He was speaking to you through the centuries. Patrick Henry, you know some of the speech, but you probably don't know all of it. Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry didn't say give me liberty or give me food stamps. Give me liberty or give me health care. It's a different kind of American. Okay? So I've got a little ending here on liberation theology being false Christianity. It's just the idea that you can't steal from one person and give it to another and call that charity, because God loves a charitable giver. Okay? So you can find these on the internet if you want, but that's pretty much my final thought is this. Okay? We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. We have a moral, spiritual problem with our economy. Thank you very much.
Dr. Paul Prentice, thank you.
I really hope that you enjoyed the moral basis of capitalism. Once again, that's part one of three. We have 3 parts called Free People, Free Markets. Our next video for this evening is by Marilyn Barnwell. Marilyn Barnwell has developed a lot of expertise in the area of having a state banking system instead of a Federal Reserve system. And the idea is there's actually a state-owned banking system. There's one working very successfully in North Dakota. There might be a couple of more in other states around the nation. Just North Dakota, that's what I understand. Okay, just North Dakota for now, but it's very successful. And one reason it's successful, of course, is because North Dakota has a very strong economy. But Maryland's argument is one reason it has a strong economy is because it's got a strong state banking system. So I think you'll really enjoy her talk as well. If I could just take for a minute now and read a little bit of her background, you'd be surprised. I was surprised at just how impressive her resume is. Okay, how about this? And it was just my pleasure to meet Marilyn at the Economic Summit up in Denver. It was a fantastic days worth of events. So, Marilyn Barnwell received her graduate degree in banking from the University of Colorado Graduate School of Business in 1978. She created the first wealth creation, credit-driven private bank in America in the 1970s. Prior to her 21-year banking career, she was a newspaper reporter, advertising copywriter, public relations director, magazine editor, assistant to the publisher, singer, dog trainer, and an insurance salesperson and manager. So like most of us, she's been around. She was named one of America's top 100 businesswomen in the book, What It Takes, and that was published by Dolphin Doubleday. and was one of the founders of the Committee of 200, which is the official organization of America's top 200 businesswomen. She can be found in Who's Who in America, the 2005 to 2008 version, Who's Who of American Women, 2006 to 2008, Who's Who in Finance and Business, 2006 to 2008, and Who's Who in the World. I certainly hope you appreciate Marilyn Barnwell speaking to you on state banking.
Our next speaker is not a stranger to the speaking stage, both nationally and internationally. Marilyn Barnwell has been highly demanded of, in part because of the in-depth research that she has done on the world of private banking, profitability, and her yearly published surveys. As a result of her research, she coined the terms like upscale, active and passive, and those types of investors. Her research became known as the active passive energy syndrome, otherwise known as APES, and included interviews with over 500 of America's self-made affluents. After 2 decades of working for banks directly, she started her own company specializing in marketing segmentation, strategies designed to identify affluent and middle-class customer niches. She started with wealth creation, private banking in America, and in 1989, Forbes magazine hailed her as the Dean of American Private Banking. She's also been named Who's Who in America in 2005, Who's Who in American Women, 2006, Who's Who in Finance and Business, 2006, and Who's Who in the World, 2008. Town and Country magazine calls her the guru of North American private banking. And please give a warm welcome to my friend, financial guru, Miss Marilyn Barnwell.
Thank you very much, Representative Connie. You know, one of the things that I've learned in the past couple of months since I met Representative Ray Scott at the last Save America thing that I took part in the Doubletree Inn in Grand Junction. I'm a Denver native, by the way, transplanted to Grand Junction in '95. There's a difference in the words politician and elected official. These two guys are elected officials. I have had so much of my own confidence restored between the two of them and the work they've done on state banks. The one thing I want to say about the word state banks before we even start, it sounds like a socialist term, like the bank you're going to be doing business with, driving up, you know, the ATMs and all of that, car loans. It isn't. That's not what it is. But I'm not going to talk about what a state bank is until I kind of get to the end of this presentation, mainly because I want to tell you why we need them first and what the benefits are that we get from state banks. Sounds like it's a dull term. Banking is not the most exciting topic in the world. And then I realized I was all in black today, and talking about banking in the current economic environment was probably not a good idea. I do want to apologize for having to talk to you sitting down. I have arthritis throughout my spine, and I can't stand very long. That's why I retired from the speaker's circuit back in '93. The other thing I will tell you, I will be clearing my throat. I might as well get all this out in the open right up front. I had throat surgery this year. I looked a little like I had a date with OJ, but I didn't. But the fact is, I clear my throat as a result of it. I'll get through it. I want to start by showing you some slides. The slides have absolutely nothing to do with state banks. They have everything to do with why we need state banks. In Boise, Idaho, 1 out of every 21 homes is in foreclosure. In Sarasota, Florida, also 1 in 21 homes in foreclosure. Lakeland, Florida, 1 in 21. Well, when we get to Tampa, 1 in 20 homes in foreclosure. Port St. Lucie, Florida, 1 in 19 homes in foreclosure. Sacramento, California, Nancy Pelosi's home out there, 1 in 19 homes in foreclosure. Deltona, Florida, 1 in 17 homes in foreclosure. Bakersfield, California, 1 in 17 homes in foreclosure. Now we're in Senator Harry Reid's home state, Reno, Nevada, 1 in 16 homes in foreclosure. Vallejo, California, 1 in 16 homes in foreclosure. Orlando, Florida, Disney World, 1 in 15 homes in foreclosure. Merced, California, 1 in 14 homes in foreclosure. Stockton, California, 1 in 14 homes. Riverside, California, that's about as middle class as you can get. 1 of 14 homes in foreclosure. Miami, 1 in 14 homes in foreclosure. Phoenix, we're getting closer to home. 1 in 14 homes in foreclosure. Modesto, California, 1 in 14. Cape Coral, Florida, 1 in 12. And now we're back to Senator Reid's state, Las Vegas. 1 in 9 homes are in foreclosure in Las Vegas, Nevada. Now, the Federal Reserve, the Federal Reserve Act passed, as you all know, in 1913. So in 2013, the Federal Reserve will be 100 years old. If we allow it to continue, I would recommend an early burial. And one, by the way, without honor. It didn't earn it. I was interested in hearing John Michael refer to the Fed as, a private corporation. I call it a cartel. It's a cartel of bankers owned and run for the benefit of bankers, just like OPEC runs its cartel to the advantage of oil-producing nations. The Fed, in my view, is not a legitimate central bank. And I want to take just a couple of seconds and tell you why. The Federal Reserve, if you really look at what it does, is a wholesaler of our money. It's a middleman. It really does nothing. It creates nothing, and it gets paid very well for doing that. That's really the truth about the Federal Reserve System. And it's a system. It isn't a bank. So when you say Federal Reserve Bank, it is an inaccurate statement. It's the Federal Reserve System. I say it's not legitimate. I want to talk about the Constitution of the United States of America, Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have the power. It doesn't say the Federal Reserve System. It doesn't say even the Federal Reserve Bank. The Congress shall have power to borrow money on the credit of the United States to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and Indian tribes. The Congress shall have power to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard weights and measures. Now, thanks to Congressman Ron Paul and a lot of other people who had a lot of courage, because I started writing about Ron Paul and his bill to get the Federal Reserve audited at the very time it started. And boy, initially he couldn't find anyone to support him. And the Federal Reserve was performing so badly that he ended up with almost the entire House of Representatives supporting his legislation. But as John Michael was saying, the audit that they did, and it's only a partial audit, about half, they estimate, they really don't know how much, a great deal of what the Federal Reserve System does is off balance sheet. Now, if that doesn't scare you, nothing will. I have a friend who's very highly placed in government who has told me that the only way they will ever really know what the Federal Reserve owes and has agreed to is if and when it fails, and he says, by the way, This is not a day-to-day thing. It's an hour-to-hour thing at this current time. But he says the only way they will know is to have people come forward with the off-balance sheet deals that have been made, and they're going to have to be able to prove they have the deal. And if they can prove it, we'll have to deal with it. And if they can't prove it, we'll say, sorry, we can't deal with it. But the audit shows $16 trillion in zero interest loans, or near zero. The interesting thing was that they were secret loans, that they were to American and foreign banks and businesses. And as John Michael said, the usual names. Citibank got, let's see, I want to go back up here. Citibank got $2.5 trillion. Morgan Stanley got $2.04 trillion. Merrill Lynch got $1.9 trillion. Bank of America $1.3 trillion. And since B of A and Merrill Lynch are now the same, they ended up getting 3.2, so they got the highest amount. So it wasn't just Wall Street bankers that got money. 3.1 trillion went to foreign financial institutions. The biggest one, I believe, was Deutsche Bank in Germany, which is, you know, we're hearing all about how strong the German economy is right now, that they're going to take over the Europe, they and Sarkozy in France and so on. Well, they sure got a lot of money. One of the things, by the way, that I think is confusing to Americans is, how can they do this? How can they hide this money? The United States, the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve System are kissing cousins. The United States supports and pays for 40% of the International Monetary Fund's activities. So it's very hard to identify the funds flowing out. Are they international monetary funds? Are they Federal Reserve funds? That's how they get away with a lot of this, just so you know. The point of the photographs and these comments about the Fed, because I'm here to talk about state banks, not the Federal Reserve System, while they were doing all of this, 6.5 million American homeowners were either delinquent or facing foreclosure on their mortgages. Every one of those red dots that was up there is a heartbreak, a broken dream. And they're giving our money to Deutsche Bank. So, are we having an adventure? That I don't know about. Anyway, self-fulfilling prophecy here. Here's our debt. And if you think it can be repaid, you're dreaming. A new article that's out, research data, if all money owned by all American banks, businesses, and individuals was gathered up today and sent to the U.S. government, there would not be enough to pay just our national debt. The only way to create more money is to go out and make more money, which immediately does what? Creates more debt, because every dollar that's printed is already 46 cents in the hole. So there is no way that we can pay this debt. This is the game that's being played, and it is being played, and it has been planned. It's been very well planned. I wrote a chapter of the history of the change of the banking legislation that our legislators gave us after the Great Depression. Glass-Steagall, of course, the McFadden Act that prevented interstate branch banking and so on. But it goes back even more. And any of you that want to read that chapter out of The Flight of the Black Swan, which is my latest book, I wrote another one that was about fiat currency and that kind of thing. Black Swan is more about the collapse of the Federal Reserve System and our currency. I'll be glad to send you that chapter over the internet on email. My email address is Marilyn Wrights, W-R-I-T-E-S, Marilyn Wrights @juno.com. Just send me an email, and I'll be glad to send you a copy of Chapter 9 that deals with the economic history of the banking changes, this is not an accident. It's not a mistake. It's not something that happened because George W. Bush is dumb or Obama isn't doing precisely what Obama wants to have done with the economy collapsing. This has been a very planned event. Now, we're $15 trillion in debt. We spend $1.50 for every dollar of revenue we receive. That's unsustainable. Every dollar, as I said, is 46 cents in debt when it's barely printed. So therefore, it isn't a dollar. It's barely a half dollar. There's some unlawful implications here. You know that if you or I turned a piece of paper into something and took it out and called it a dollar, said this is worth a dollar, the word counterfeiting might come up. But the Federal Reserve and the Treasury can do this. Obviously, they play by different game rules than we do. This all gets back to my basic point with the slides of the cities. The Fed has damaged the country. The Fed has damaged the people. The best way to correct the problem of the Federal Reserve is to implement state banks. To capsulize our problem in America economically right now, we have too much centralized power. What state banks does is decentralize the financial part of this too much centralized power. There are other things that need to be decentralized too, but since the banks tend to, or the system tends to fund all of those other things, it's a really good place to start. Because what it does is cuts off the head of the snake by removing state dollars from being sent to the Federal Reserve. Okay. Another comment I'd make, by the way, it's very, very important to understand this. I don't know how many of you have read the reports on this rage thing that's supposed to happen on the 17th of December. Yeah, September, isn't it the 7th? Yeah, and so on. If the Federal Reserve gets taken down improperly, violently, you can take what we have that we can expect to happen right now and multiply the damage by 10. It has got to be done lawfully. It has got to be done peacefully. But it's got to be done. They do have to come down. You might want to ask yourself this question. I do a lot. How can we, without being hypocritical, and I always remember Christ and "O ye hypocrites" on the steps of the temple. How can we go to those who are violating our constitutional rights and unconstitutionally remove their power to do so without being a hypocrite? There are legal, lawful, honorable ways to do this. When our founding fathers decided they'd had enough of England and the crown, they did something. They wrote a document. What was it called again? Declaration. Yeah, our Bill of Rights that came after with the Constitution. We need to do it right. That's why I consider state banks to be the most critical issue that we can deal with. Well, you may wonder, if I'm here to talk about state banks, why am I talking so much about the Fed? I wanted you to understand from my perspective why it's so important, why it's a critical issue, why we've got to get rid of this creature from Jekyll Island, as Ed says in his book so eloquently. I also want to tell you that state banks is a very popular idea right now. I started writing about the state banking system, the concept, about a little over 2 years ago. And since that time, I think probably there are a lot of people in North Dakota who are very angry at me because they get a lot of calls from around the country. But since that time, Washington, Oregon, California, Hawaii, Illinois, Montana, Florida, Virginia, Maryland, Virginia, and Massachusetts have all begun the legislative process of implementing a state bank. And I asked Ray Scott, Representative Scott, and asked him if it was okay to tell our live audience here in Colorado that he will place state bank legislation before the Colorado legislature when it reconvenes in January 2012. And thank you, Representative Scott and Representative Conti, for their support on this. They have been marvelous. There's only one state bank in the United States, and it is in North Dakota. Bank of North Dakota, or as we lovingly call it, BND. So, because we get tired of saying Bank of North Dakota sometimes. It is 93 years old, formed in 1919. So when we talk about what we can expect from a state bank, we don't have to guess. We've got history on our side. What are the benefits of a state bank? The first thing I have to say, I don't have time to tell you now, but please accept the fact we have state chartered banks in Colorado now. Most states have state chartered banks, right? This is not the same thing. This is a state-owned bank. It's not a state-chartered bank. The state bank, when you have a state-owned bank, charters members itself. So it is not a state-chartered bank. They're two different things. Okay. It's a confusing explanation, so just accept, please, my word for it. They're very different. A state bank is owned by the state. A state-chartered bank is not. Okay. Now, here's some of the things you can expect from a state bank based on results from the North Dakota State Bank. With a population of about 650,000 people, the North Dakota State Bank has, during the past 10 years, paid the state of North Dakota $325 million from bank profits. In 2010, I believe also in 2009, the worst economy in recent history, where every state is having a budget deficit, especially in places like Colorado that's so dependent on tourism, North Dakota had its largest budget surplus in that state's history. North Dakota tops the list of state economies year after year. But let's talk about jobs. Unemployment, as John Michael was saying, you know, if you look at the statistics, it's 9.1. We all know it's closer to 19, 20% when you take into consideration the people who have given up looking for work or who have taken a job as a hamburger flipper. If you go to some place like Detroit, Michigan, you're looking at 50%. I have a friend in Michigan who says, you cannot believe how bad it is here. But let's just take their numbers. The national unemployment rate, 9.1%. Colorado, 8.5%. North Dakota, as of July 2011, 3.3%. Reducing taxes. Here's a benefit from a state bank. In 2011, North Dakotans will see almost $500 million of their money returned to them in the form of income and property tax cuts. Now, if you take the 2009 and 2011 tax reductions, the average North Dakotan will enjoy a 30% tax liability drop. The legislature also funded $342 million in property tax relief. How long has it been since we've heard that? The word property tax relief instead of increase. The owner of a $150,000 home will enjoy a tax reduction of $506. Not bad. So here's the breakdown of how their tax reduction program went in North Dakota. $342 million approximately in property tax relief. That money goes to the superintendent of schools for grants to school districts under the mill levy reduction program. I love those words, mill levy reduction. Oh, instead of increase. $120 million reduces all individual income tax rates by 17.9%. $25 million reduces all existing corporate income tax rates by 19.5%. Does anybody wonder why business is moving to North Dakota? Representative Scott was telling me the other day, he had a friend who went there. He had to drive 80 miles on a 2-lane highway out in the country, paved, all very nice. It took him 4 hours. The traffic is so heavy in North Dakota on its highways. This is not Los Angeles and Disneyland or Orlando and Disney World type tourism. This is business traffic. He said it was literally stop and go in some places. So the $25 million reduces the corporate tax by 19.5. You have a $2.125 million reduction in financial institutions tax rate to get them to loan. And they are loaning in North Dakota. By the way, they haven't had a bank failure during this entire crisis. So if you support schools or reduced income taxes, which stimulate retail sales, which stimulates job creation, you support state banks. The Bank of North Dakota is a big reason that the state has been able to do what they've done with taxes and so on. On July 18th, I found an Associated Press article reported that jobs in North Dakota increased by 61,000 since 2000. That doesn't sound like a lot of jobs, unless you're losing jobs, which we are in Colorado. But this is only a 700,000 population, less than 700,000. And the Denver suburban area is 2.5 million just by itself, without getting into Grand Junction and Durango and Pueblo and so on. So how do we know? Oh, I meant to say about 15,000 of their jobs are still available in North Dakota if you're looking or you know anyone else who is looking. But how do we know, how can we tell that the Bank of North Dakota is largely responsible for the state's economic performance? The first time I talked about state banks was at the Pueblo Liberty Action Group. And one of the first questions asked was, how much of an impact did the Bakken oil fields have on North Dakota's wealth? Well, I looked it up actually after that night. Montana and South Dakota and Wyoming all enjoyed an energy boom. Montana and Wyoming have extracted far more gas and oil than North Dakota. The Bakken oil field stretches across Montana as well as North Dakota, and the greatest oil production comes from the Elm Coulee field in Montana, not North Dakota. The unemployment rate in Montana is 7.7%. It's 3.3% in North Dakota. Alaska has roughly the same population North Dakota has. It produces about twice as much oil as they're getting out of the Bakken fields. Unemployment in Alaska is also 7.7%. In 2000, this is a good statistic. I really like this one. In 2009, North Dakota's payroll growth, key statistic to business growth, payroll growth in the private, not the public, the private sector, was 5.2%. The payroll growth in Texas, placed it second at 2.6%. That's exactly half of the performance in North Dakota. I would point out that Texas is the largest oil-producing state in the Union at 1 million barrels per day. So it's not the oil of the Bakken fields that is driving this wealth that's going on in North Dakota. North Dakota's fourth in oil production since Bakken. Texas is first, Alaska second. Surprisingly, California is third. And if you haven't heard about the unemployment statistical data coming out of California, it's pretty terrible. It's way up in the mid 25%. At least that's what they're admitting to. So what is it they have in North Dakota that they don't have in Texas, Alaska, and California? A state bank. So now, what is a state bank? Finally, it's an administrative function. It's not a bank on a street corner. It's an administrative function. It's an administrative function that owns a vault. And that vault is going to have a lot of cash in it. Either Federal Reserve notes or perhaps when everything falls apart, it could have its own state currency in it. The fact of the matter is you can't have a state currency without a state bank, but we'll get to that in a minute. The vault holds the state's money. Every state collects taxes and fees, but only North Dakota can keep it in state because it owns its own bank that owns its own vault. Now understand what that means. It has a state bank so it can put state taxes and state fees into that bank to invest in not Wells Fargo's deposits, who they're headquartered in San Francisco, or Bank of America's deposits, they're headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, or Citigroup's, they're headquartered in New York City. They keep them in North Dakota. The other 49 states don't. They largely put their deposits in major banks, and they get loaned out outside of the banks. As an administrator, the bank grants charters to state banks saying, okay, you can, okay, you can't, depending on the quality of the investors in the bank, depending on the quality of the loan policies and controls that they have. The point is, the banks that the people and businesses continue to do business with are owned just as they are now by independent investors. But now, instead of being licensed by the comptroller of the currency, and instead of being totally governed, the new legislation makes it possible for the Federal Reserve to govern anything that turns over $1 on any day. But the fact is, they aren't tied to the Federal Reserve should the Federal Reserve fail. And that's one of the biggest reasons. If the financial system fails, what are your national banks going to be able to do? Fail with the federal system, because that's the system the national banks are tied to. Okay. So it administers things. The state bank administers things. How am I on time? Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. It administers things. It doesn't run the banks on Main Street. That's the big message. As I said when I started, this sounds like a socialist system. It is 180 degrees the opposite of a socialist system. It decentralizes the power base in Washington of the Federal Reserve System and New York. The other thing that it does, a state bank acts as a correspondent bank for its chartered members. Do you all know what a correspondent bank is? Anybody? Okay. If I'm a small bank and I'm sitting on Main Street in Alamosa, and a company comes and they say, God, I really like Alamosa. I want to build a company here, and I need this much money. And because this is, not Denver, Colorado Springs, it doesn't have the money. So what happens now is that bank, that little bank, has to go to Wells Fargo or Bank of America or one of the other too big to jail guys and get and offer this loan, to them to participate. They become then a correspondent bank. With a state bank, instead of going to these big banks, they go to the state bank. And the state decides, is this the best for the economy? And so on. The decisions are made on the basis of the state, the welfare of the state and the people, and the economy of of the state. Okay. Does that make it clear what a correspondent bank is? They share loans. They also dictate some terms. They get paid for it, and so on. So here's an organizational chart for a state bank. Now, in North Dakota, that chart over, you have the governor up at the top. And I understand sometimes you have lousy governors just like you have lousy presidents. But let me tell you what, it's a whole lot easier, I don't care what state you live in, to get on a bus and go to the state capitol than it is to get on an airplane and go to Washington, D.C. if you have somebody who's doing something out of line. But other states have other economic strengths. In North Dakota, the advisory board is made up of the state treasurer. This is the economic advisory board. The state treasurer, the head of the agriculture department, and others who represent the economic objectives of the state, like agriculture, oil, gas, technology. And these are the stated objectives, economic objectives of the state of North Dakota. Now, other states have other economic strengths they would want represented on that advisory board. Agriculture, gas, uranium, oil shale, tourism in Colorado, perhaps coal in Utah, or timber in Washington. In other words, it allows you to gain advantage to your state economy for your natural resources. If that makes sense to everybody. Now, that middle group on the chart is the financial advisory group, and they're the bankers. They are not politicians. And by the way, I have checked and checked and checked. This bank is not a political toy. It is not a general mini Federal Reserve. This bank functions for the benefit of the people of North Dakota, and largely because of the makeup of these committees. They are like this. The economic advisory group says, okay, here's where we need to create and support business growth. Agriculture, and they get together with this middle group, that's the loan, and say, okay, what kind of loan policies do we need to be more supportive of the kind of agriculture that we have in North Dakota, like we have winter wheat in Colorado? Well, they don't have that anyplace else, so it's kind of hard on bank credit sometime to deal with that. This lets you deal with the specific issues of your state, and that gets back to the decentralization process. Okay, so what does a state bank do that makes such a huge impact? Well, I've kind of covered it, but more specifically, keeping in state the tax and fee income the state receives rather than having them deposited in a large money center bank. And the state bank gives a portion of its profits to the Treasury, which then allows the Treasury to reduce taxes and support the education system and so on by increasing personal income, retail sales. And it's a spin-off effect. And the other 49 states, we deposit our money in those large banks. We support the very Federal Reserve system we all clap and would like to get rid of. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. So, one thing for sure, by the way, the big banks don't pay any part of their profit to the state. They do pay taxes if they can't find a loophole for it. But it has been estimated that because of this one thing, keeping your tax dollars and your fees within the state, one thing can turn the entire economy in a state around within 1 year. And there have been estimates as high as a 600% ratio of variance between what you have now and what you can have if you keep those state taxes and fees within the state. Well, you know, to my libertarian friends, I know you all hate the idea of anybody having any control over this kind of a system, but the fact of the matter is, you have to have a managed financial system for a variety of reasons. Do we need to pay attention to what's going on? You bet we do. Fact of the matter is, if we citizens had, back in 1913 and thereafter, paid attention to what the Federal Reserve System was doing with these little tiny incremental steps leading us to destruction, we wouldn't be where we are right now. We have some responsibility to bear for this too. You know, allowing or enabling isn't the best way in the world to create a strong system. But without an organized system of finance to replace a failed federal system, should the federal system fail, economic chaos is going to occur if there is no state banking system. And now I want to get to the critical nature of why this is important. If things in the state financial services industry begin to go awry, it's a lot easier. Oh, no, wait, I want to skip that. I'll come back to it. State banks deal. Oh, yeah, the two key. I said I'd get to these. Come on, Marilyn. Oh, it's awful to get old. Don't get old. Currency, state currency, and being able to declare sovereignty. You can do neither without a state bank. Now, we have all these states that have declared sovereignty, right? I mean, I've got a list of them somewhere on here. It's what I was looking for. Oh, there they are. We have Alabama, Nebraska, Rhode Island, Wyoming, Washington, Indiana, Kentucky, Georgia, Kansas, Missouri, Mississippi, and Maryland have all passed sovereignty laws. To be sovereign, two things have to occur. You have to have de jure and de facto. You have to declare yourself sovereign, which these states have done. We're sovereign states. We have the right to be sovereign. You must also be sovereign in fact. And part of that de facto or in fact statement says that you have a declared piece of land with a declared population, which a state has, and you must be in control of your monetary system. Because if you aren't in control of your monetary system, how do you do trade? How can people rely on your credit as a state? How do you pay your state bills? You know, think in terms of what happens when the national system falls. The national banks aren't going to accept your new currency. They can't. The feds wouldn't let them, number one. Number two, they wouldn't know what to do with it if they had it. So how do you, with a new currency, and once you're sovereign, believe me, they aren't going to let you use a Federal Reserve note. So you're going to have to create your own currency. How do you get your paychecks cashed? How do you pay your bills? Because guess who clears every check that you write? The Federal Reserve System. The thing, and one of the most important parts about state banks is this. They can tomorrow, if the system North Dakota uses the Federal Reserve System right now, but guess what? If the Fed failed tomorrow, they could open their doors the next day and clear their own checks immediately. It's a convenience right now. So properly structured, a state bank will enable declarations of sovereignty because it gives you the ability to control your own financial system, monetary system. And you can't, even if you don't declare sovereignty. If your state says, we want to create our own currency, again, you get back to the question of the national banks can't deal with your state's currency. The Fed won't let them. Who's going to be in charge of the distribution system for a state currency? There's only one answer to that: a state bank. So what a state bank does in the end analysis is this: it lets you keep every alternative open without having to exercise them unless it becomes necessary, if that's what you want to do. It enables you to declare sovereignty. It enables you, should everything else fail, and it can happen very quickly. But you have to have a state bank in place to be able to do these things. And believe me, once it falls, it's too late. Because as Representative Conti and Representative Scott can tell you, it is a major headache putting this together. And I will tell you this, too. I'm going to close with this. How am I done on time? John? Okay. I want to close with this. I believe this is going to come down to being a citizen alternative. I believe you're going to have to, and I am going to have to go out and get petitions signed. You want to know why? There is not a big bank in this state or any other. There is not a bank association in this state or any other that isn't totally intimidated and threatened by the concept of this implementing state banks for the benefit of the people. Why? It upsets their power base. And if Representatives Conti and Scott are able to get this legislation onto, proposed into the legislature, it will have to be voted on. By the way, Colorado State Constitution will require it to be a vote of the people on this. You are going to see so much negative advertising about how, oh my God, this is a socialist system. Oh my, you can't do that. You will. I'm sure they'll find ways to bring infants and pregnant women and dogs that are in, puppies, kittens. They will throw everything. And my fear is that there aren't enough politicians in our legislature that have the courage of Representative Conti and Representative Scott. I have a feeling this is going to go to the people if we're going to get it done, and get it done in time. So that's what I have to say about state banks. I just happen to think it's probably the most critical issue that we, the people, can, honest to God, do something about instead of talk about. And one of the things, by the way, I love about the Save America Foundation is I really like being around people who talk about solutions instead of continuing to educate me about the problems. I know what the problems are. Most of you know what the problems are. But anyway, thank you very much for your kind attention. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Modern day founding father, the modern day founding mother, right here, Marilyn Barnwell. Make no mistake about it. Please visit SaveAmericaFoundation.com. She has written the battle plan for this initiative, and it's posted there. And all the different areas that you can help, and there are numerous things because it's an action item. They're all listed there, so please visit the site and support Marilyn and Kathleen Conti and Ray Scott as we travel around this country. So all the other states are supportive of this initiative. It can't be done without your help and the help of these folks in the House and Congress. So please, another round of applause for Marilyn Barnwell.
Thank you so much, John. I just want to make mention of the fact that when we started meeting with Marilyn, and it takes a while to wrap your mind around this concept. And I can tell you that it's taking a while for leadership to wrap its mind around this concept. And one of the difficult things is how you sell this, and and it takes a while to explain this, and it's almost an idea that has to marinate, because you do approach it and it sounds initially very socialistic. But then the more you hear about it, the more you're like, oh, but it kind of opens up. So keep in mind what she's had to present here in about an hour suddenly has to be presented in about a 2-minute soundbite. Hard to do. And this is one of the reasons why we're looking at, and probably going to be reduced to a study, not a bill, but a resolution. A resolution that will allow us to study this as to the specific implementation and how the monetary benefits that would be for the state of Colorado with our unique strengths as a state that we have. Like she was talking about, that you would need representation on the different panels so that they could understand those unique industries and attributes. So thank you very much for that presentation, and please know that we will be continuing to work with that and keep you updated as we move along. And also, we want to also mention the state banking DVD that is available out in the lobby for the low price of merely $10, a definite bargain you have to go home with multiples of.
Ready?
Well, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed Marilyn Barnwell's presentation on estate banking. And in fact, I hope you've enjoyed the entire evening with the Pikes Peak Economics Club, even though we didn't have a live event for you. I do want to mention a couple of Marilyn's books. She's written 2 books, which is a sequence of part 1 and part 2. And they're in the spirit of Atlas Shrugged, in the sense that they're fictional novels written purposefully to teach lessons on economics, political economy, and banking. And they're highly recommended. One is called When the Swan's Neck Breaks. When the Swan's Neck Breaks, by Marilyn Barnwell. Highly recommend this. And then part 2 is called Flight of the Black Swan, by Marilyn Barnwell. And of course, the idea is the black swan is an almost impossible, once in a whatever bazillion odds of happening, but yet it happened. People call the financial meltdown a black swan event. It's something nobody foresaw or predicted. But those of us at the Austrian school saw this coming well in advance. And there's more for you at the end of that. I just want to thank once again John Michael Chambers and the Save America Foundation for hosting that economic summit. I want to thank Trace Melton with Rocky Mountain Streams for helping to put all this together and for his ongoing work with the Pikes Peak Economics Club. Thank Marilyn Barnwell certainly for her ongoing work in this area, and we'll hope to see you soon. Thank you so much.